All right, I think we can go ahead and get started here. I just want to thank everyone for joining us for this evening's event. I'm Emily, and I'm one of the event hosts here at Powell's. We have just a few events left for this year, but for our next one, we're looking forward to welcoming Catherine Sullivan, the first American woman to walk in space on Thursday, December 3rd. If you don't already, please consider following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to keep up with everything going on here at Powell's. Tonight, we are so excited to welcome Jonathan Hill and Lisa Coe. Jonathan is an award-winning cartoonist, illustrator, and educator living in Portland, Oregon. Some of his clients include the Portland Trailblazers, the Vietnam Literature Project, the Inlander, Fantagraphics Books, Dark Horse Comics, Tor.com, Lion Forge, The Believer magazine, and Powell City of Books. His first graphic novel was picked as an ABC New Voices title in 2011 and nominated by the YALSA as a 2012 Best Graphic Novel for Teens. In 2012, Americus won the Carla Cohen Free Speech Award, becoming the first graphic novel to win the award. His second book, Wild Weather, was published by First Second in 2019. He also teaches comics and visual narrative around Portland and is an associate professor in the illustration department at the Pacific Northwest College of Arts. In his new original graphic novel, Odessa, the first book he has written and drawn himself, three siblings search for their missing mother across a ruined America. Now, joining him in conversation this evening is Lisa Coe. Coe's first novel, The Leavers, was a 2017 National Book Award for Fiction finalist, won the 2016 Penn Bellwether Prize for Socially Engaged Fiction, and was a finalist for the 2018 Penn Hemingway Award. Her writing has appeared in Best American Short Stories, The New York Times, The Believer, and elsewhere. She lives in New York City. So this event will also include an audience Q&A. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please use that if you'd like to ask a question. As well, if someone has typed a question that you'd also really like to know the answer to, please upvote that particular question by giving it a thumbs up. The ones with the most thumbs up are the ones that are most likely to get answered. And perhaps most importantly, please consider supporting Jonathan and Powell's by purchasing a copy of his new book from us. We'll be sharing links to purchase the book and Lisa's book too throughout the chat this evening. Jonathan, Lisa, it's such a pleasure to welcome you. Thank you both so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having us, Emily. I think if it's okay, Lisa, I might start with a reading.
Sounds good.
So we can kind of give it some context. All right, so let's hope this tech works. So I just want to give a primer. Like Emily said, the book is about three siblings traveling across a post-apocalyptic America. The big one has kind of devastated the West Coast, and so Virginia, well, she gets a package from her mother, who she now realizes, her estranged mother, who she realizes is alive, and so she decides to go look for her, and she kind of leaves everybody behind. And so this is a little excerpt from when she's sort of on her journey. And comics are really kind of awkward to read out loud. So I'm going to just kind of, instead of giving you space to see what I'm drawing, I'm going to just kind of explain it a little bit. But so, here we have a shot of Virginia kind of walking through this car graveyard. And then these quiet moments. And then there's some word balloons that we can't tell who's saying them yet. Where did she go? I swear she went this way. I don't think she came this way. I'm telling you she came this way. I think we should turn around. Ugh, fine. And so Virginia's hiding behind this car, and she peeks out and she sees who's been following her. And hey, look, why do you think those birds are circling like, ow, bonk? And they turn around and we realize that these are her brothers. I knew it. And she throws another rock at them. Whoosh. Ah, stop it. You brats, I can't believe you were following me. What do you think you're even doing here? She's chasing her brothers, continuing to throw rocks at them. Dunk, dunk, as they hide behind a car. We came to look for Mom too. Eek, as another rock goes flying. No way, that is absolutely not happening. You stayed away in that truck, didn't you? Dunk, you sneaky little turds. Wes? There's sort of a roaring happening in the background. turns into a grrr. Come on, Harry, come on. And then they're trying to run towards Virginia. Virginia's not sure what we're seeing. Ah! As they run by her. And Virginia sees that it's a bear that's sort of hiding in that space. Oh, it's super awkward doing voices, but I'm gonna embrace it. Roar! Eek! Ah! Come on, hurry, you two. Hurry, in here. Dunk. They're in this van, this overturned van. Did they see us come in here? I don't know. I'm sorry. I was too busy running for my life to turn around and check. We see them peeking outside. I don't hear anything. It doesn't mean it's not still out there. We're just gonna have to wait it out. I peer outside. Virginia. Ugh, you're both such idiots. What the hell were you two thinking? What were we thinking? You're the one who left to look for Mom on your own. Why do you care? It's my life. God, you were so selfish. You didn't even have the guts to tell us you were leaving to our faces. You just left. I left notes for you guys and Dad. If I didn't sneak out, you would have followed me. And Harry says, ha, well, we ended up following you anyway. As soon as that dumb bear is gone, we're hiking back to the last way station and finding you two a ride home. So thanks for wasting my time. Wesley says, ha, what makes you think we're going to do that? Because I'm oldest and I said so. That crap might work at home, but it doesn't mean jack out here. We're coming with you. Right, Harry? Yeah. How are we even arguing this? There is absolutely no way you're... And then we peek out and we see the bear sniffing around inside the van. They push to the back of the van. Shh, scoot back as far as you can, quietly. And the bear continues to reach in there. So that is the little section that I have.
Did you ever think that when you became a cartoonist that you would also have to be a voice actor as well?
No, that's something I kind of wish that I wish I would have leaned into a little bit more, but you get a little nervous and you just kind of read quickly. But, I think if it's going to be embarrassing, you might as well just like own it, right?
Yeah, and I think you did a great job. And that's like one of my favorite sections of the book. I mean, one of the many things that I love about this book is like the relationships between those three siblings.
Oh, thank you.
On this like amazing adventure together. But first, I just want to say congratulations. Congratulations on the publication of Odessa. It's beautiful, it's riveting. As I'm sure you can all see from the section that Jonathan just shared with us all. And it's such a treat to be able to do this event with you from across the country. And there's so much that I loved about your book. For those of you who haven't read it yet, you should obviously get it. I'm sure you'll love it too, from the family dynamics, which I just mentioned, to the journey, to the visuals, the world or the end of the world in some ways. There's just so much talent and heart in these pages. And I know that, this is sort of a long-term project for you that you worked on for almost 10 years, right? You started it back in 2010, which is 10 years ago. And I just, one of the things I love to ask other writers is, what was the seed of the book? Like, where did it all start?
Yeah, so I guess before I get started, that is, I'm just going to do a little other also like praising, because like, I'm like, so like, this was the event I've been most excited for on the release, because The Leavers is like my favorite book since it came out. And if anybody asks me for a book rec, I'm like, buy The Leavers right now. And I'm telling everybody now to make sure, like, buy Odessa, yeah, but like buy The Leavers. And so I just am so thankful. I remember, when I was thinking about who, and we were talking about this a little bit before the event, but just there's something nice about, I mean, obviously we'd like to be in a bookstore and doing this in person, but the fact that geography is kind of destroyed because of these events. And I, was just like, well, if I could get anybody to do this event with me, who would I want? And I loved that I emailed you, or I sent you a message on Twitter, and I was like, this is going to sound weird. I was super nervous, and I was like, our books don't really kind of fit in the same space, and they have these similar themes. And so I'm just so thankful that you're here doing this with me.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
So I guess the question was, where was the seed of where Odessa came? And so this is kind of weird and awkward to talk about, because my sister-in-law was actually getting divorced,
Mhm.
And I just remember seeing my nieces and my nephew and just like how it was impacting them and like how hard it was for them to essentially see your world destroyed, right? Because like you have you know, parents and this sort of like this home, and to kind of, you know, for whatever reason it's being kind of taken away from you. And I think when you're younger you don't really understand all the reasons why. And it made me think of my parents' divorce, and when my mom left. And again, I always, like, I love my mom, I'm so close to my mom, but you know, it just made me think about that, and it made me think about my brothers and I, and how we sort of, you know, in our own way, we had to learn to take care of ourselves, right? Whether that's like learning to cook, or like do your own laundry, or, you know, just like get used to those things. And so I just thought about that relationship, and how my brothers and I, as you can see, you know, with this, the Crane siblings, like they fight all the time. My brothers and I fought all the time, but in the same space, we learned to like take care of each other and get closer to each other. And so that's kind of where the idea of the book kind of came from.
Hmm. Did you start, so you started knowing that the siblings would be the main characters, like all three of them together? Was there one that came first? Like how did both the story and the characters change shape, I guess, over the 10 years?
Yeah, so I think I knew it was going to be about my brothers, because I think, and just that sibling relationship. I think because that was, because I, and so, you know, it did take 10 years to get this done from the initial idea. And that initial idea started because in 2000, you know, in 2010, I was wrapping up my first book, Americus, and I worked on that with my friend MK, and who's also from Jersey. But she already had a book lined up,
Mhm.
and I was like, oh my gosh, like I don't have anything lined up. Like, what am I going to do? And I kept trying to come up with ideas for books. And I, you know, I'd be interested to hear if you had this same sort of process when you finished The Leavers. But like, I would keep coming up with, I felt like there was a clock, and I kept coming up with ideas, and they would be like conceptually like cool or interesting, but they didn't have any heart. They were just really hollow. It was just like, oh, this is clever, but like clever can't carry a book. You know, it's like it needs to have that heart to it. And so I just kept like, nothing worked. And then kind of was going through, you know, I was kind of seeing what my sister-in-law was going through, and then these ideas sort of formed. And then it was that idea of like, you know, yeah, the apocalypse would just be the backdrop of that,
Mm.
but it's really going to be about the siblings. And what's interesting is I actually tried to pitch it to, you know, to First Second, because I just finished a book with them, and but again, it was like in this panic mode. I had just gotten things together. It wasn't really thought out, and I sent it to Callista at First Second, who's great, and she was honest, and she was just like, um, I'm going to pass. It's not ready.
Mm.
The world building's not. She gave me some notes. She was very kind about it, and I just remember being like, oh my god, like I was like devastated. You know, it's my first like
Yeah.
my first book happened kind of easily because like MK knew Callista, and so it just sort of happened. And then this one, I was like, oh, I have this thing. I feel ready, and then it gets turned down, and I just remember like crying, like not even having any control over it. You know.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and then so it took. I think life kind of took turns the way that it turns, and I kind of was out of it for a little bit, but eventually I think I was able to be in a space where it was ready, and then it got picked up. And so it was yeah, so I mean, that's a very long boring story about how sometimes things can take a long time to germinate. But if I remember correctly, The Leavers was kind of similar to that, right? Like this wasn't something you're just like, oh, here's this book, here I make it and it's done, and like it's published. Oh, it's this easy step. It was sort of a longer process, and it was sort of an idea that germinated as well and sort of grew. Is that, am I remembering that correctly, or am I way off base?
Yeah, I mean, it took me about 7 years also to finish right from the beginning to publication. And I think one thing that you said that resonated with me was like this idea of it being like you could have this idea, you could have a theme or a setting, but if there's not that heart to it, it doesn't really have enough to withstand, you know, a story or a book. And that was, I think, a really big part of the learning process for me too, was kind of thinking like, you know, I want to write about these larger themes or these external issues, but really the more important part, or like the critical part of it, was also figuring out like the internal kind of motivations to my characters, right? And that was also
Mhm.
tied to like my own internal motivations for telling the story, I think.
Yeah.
And I thought about it too when like thinking about Odessa, and like, you know, I feel like for people who work on a book for 10 years, right? Like it takes a certain amount, I mean, it takes a certain kind of person to know how to do that.
Yeah.
Whether you call it stubbornness or denial or faith, or, you know, all three of those things in different ways. I mean, when you work on something for so long, you know, not only do you have to like commit to it and the meaning of it, right? But it also becomes like such a like a living, breathing part of your life, because you're in some ways you're carrying it with you no matter what you do, right? You're not doing it 24 hours a day. You're still working and dealing with your life, but part of that book is always, I think, with you. And so I think often about like my own motivation to work on projects, including the Levers and other projects. It kind of like it comes out of me wanting to answer a question in some ways, or a series of questions. Like that, the process of writing the book is me trying to figure something out, right? And so I wanted to ask you, when you were writing Odessa, like, was there something that you were trying to figure out through the process of writing the book that could be answered through writing the book? You know, a question you're trying to answer, or a problem that you're trying to solve, whether it's like a metaphorical problem or a literal problem.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I was like, oh crap, I don't know that it was a question. I'm like, but I think what it was is, when I was doing it, I realized that it was, I mean, it was like a love letter to my brothers. I think so there's three of us, kind of like the Cranes, and my middle brother Jeremiah, he passed away in 2012, and he took his own life, and it was really hard. And I think the idea of the story changed to be that love letter. I think after that, where I think it, you know, it, because like you're saying, when you're working on something, again, it's not like you're working on it all the time. It's like, for me, it was like something that was like, I would think about, it was just always hovering over my head, and I was always thinking about it. Like, you know, like you lay down to go to sleep, and I would be like, I'd think about, well, okay, I need to like bore myself to death to fall asleep. So I'll be like, well, I'll think about the story, like this scene, and so it's like slowly building up, and it's slowly like taking shape over that time. And it wasn't until, you know, much later that it was like, okay, now these are these sort of concrete things. But I think it was kind of from that, it was that sort of like that. I think it initially started out as just being like examining sort of what it's like when you're, and this is why I think the Lever struck so much with me, is this, it kind of the same idea of like, when you're left behind, what is it like to be left behind, whether it's a divorce, or your mom gets taken away by ICE, or like you're dumped, or someone dies suddenly. Like, we all have these answers that we want, we have all these questions we want answers to. And so, you know, I think it kind of came from the search of that, like the search for answers. Like, the original title was actually kind of inspired by the Levers. It was The Searchers. That was the original title of the book, was The Searchers. And because I just love that simplicity, and that, like, it made me think of like old sort of like middle grade books too, of like the Giver, the, you know, like the Rescuers, that sort of thing. But then I think, and I love the title Odessa, but I'm glad that Oni was like, because, you know, it's also the title of an old John Wayne Western. And they were just like, yeah, we like that, but that's just going to cause a headache down the way. So, you know, so I think it started out as a sort of long-winded answer to that, was it started out as that search for answers from being left behind. And then I think it turned, and I think the seed was always there, but it was always sort of like a, you know, a love letter. I think it became a love letter to my brothers more openly and more wholeheartedly, kind of like as the book came along.
Yeah, and I can see that. I mean, that to me is clearly like the heart of the book, right? Is that family relationship, and the sibling relationship in particular, that's done so beautifully. Were you? I love thinking about it as the searchers, right? Because they all three of them. I mean, really, all the characters in the book are searchers for something, whether it's the siblings or their uncle, or Tallulah, who's one of my favorite characters. And, you know, I have a line that she said partway through the book, written down here, that I really loved. It's like this idea of, she says, like, the great disaster wasn't just earthquakes that ended the world we had built. It was wounds in the earth tearing open, and bleeding strange and unknown things into this world. And that just really struck me, because I feel like, we are living in these times in particular where like there is a lot of end of days rhetoric in the air that's both like real and emotional, right? And I was curious, like, what, like, not only how did you build this kind of future world, and was placing this storyline within this world kind of part of the original idea, or was it something that kind of developed through like working out the characters and their relationships?
Yeah, I think, and I don't know, like I think world building is kind of really hard for me. And I think one of the biggest things, like you put a book out into the world and you're just like, I have these things on my radar that I like feel are not strong, or like I'm just like really self-conscious of. And so it makes me feel really great to have someone read it, and someone I admire, and anybody that's read it and it's like, oh, I love this world building, because I think that was something I was really worried about, because I can get really, I just want to make it believable, because I hate when you're watching a movie or you're reading a book, or I'm reading a graphic novel or a comic or something, and I just start asking, like, it doesn't, I can't suspend my disbelief anymore, because I'm like, well, how does money work? Or why are they doing this? Like, if this is the rules you've set for the world, like, why are they doing, like, I don't understand this, And so like, that was my biggest like thing I was worried about in making this world. And I think how I approached it was just like just try to think of it simply, in terms of like, okay, if there's this earthquake, and it's, again, it's sort of based off that, Cascadia subduction zone that is, I think it's actually going to devastate Oregon and Washington more than it will California. But just this idea of like, okay, if there's this crazy earthquake and it splits California in half, and it's sort of, we don't even know the effects of everywhere else in the world, but just imagining that, like, okay, just sort of asking questions about, well, how would that affect things? Like, well, we won't have distribution for food or for clothes or for new things, like, electronics probably won't exist in the same way. And so just trying to think of this, like, like, oh, they become homesteaders, and, like communities, and trying to think about like people responding in different ways. So in Oregon, or, when it starts out, it's like they've built a community that's tight knit and supports each other and cares for each other and self-sufficient. But then as they go further south, and I spent a lot of time growing up in California, my family's in California, I have nothing against California, but like just trying to have this idea of like, oh, that's where the most sort of devastation would be, that we kind of, people might go to their baser instincts of just like survival of the fittest. And but then there's weird stuff about like the money. I feel like that's such a hard soft world building, where I was like, I need them to sort of trade and transfer things, but I didn't know how to do it. So I'm like, okay, they have money, like, who cares, like, but then trying to tie that in. So I don't know, again, like, I think there's probably someone could probably hold it up and poke a lot of holes into it, but I think what clarified for me was just trying to answer questions and make it as believable, so people don't get bored of it or start asking questions about it.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's surprising to hear that that's one of the more like challenging parts of writing for you, because it felt believable to me, and I feel like anybody who's skilled enough to make something just feel authentic, it doesn't matter how outlandish it might be, right? You can make the reader believe it, right? So I didn't question any of the logistics, I guess.
No, that's great. And I guess is it, because with your work, it's kind of more grounded. It's fiction, and it's grounded, just more, it's not this sort of like speculative fiction or science fiction or anything, but like, what's sort of your process to world building in that? Do you like, how do you approach that in your writing?
It's, it's both like, I think it has a different set of challenges when you're
Mm-hmm.
working in like realism, because it is something that can be fact checked, right? Whereas if
Yeah.
you build a world that doesn't exist, then you get to set the rules, and nobody can just be like, I'm gonna look on Wikipedia and like, after the Great Earthquake, it was actually 5 years where this happened.
Yeah.
It was, like,
Yeah.
and then write you like a shitty review on like Goodreads, right? So yeah, so there is that challenge, I think, and then I guess for writers who are working with real settings and real events, in some ways, there is like the potential to get really bogged down in doing research, right? Because you can kind of get to this point where you're like, yeah, I want to know exactly, did that happen on Monday, June 14th, 2003? Was June 14th a Monday? Was it a Tuesday? What was like, you know,
Yeah,
what
yeah,
exactly, what street would this be on? What would somebody be wearing? And again, that's like also a fun thing about writing, because you get to do all that Googling and reading. On the other hand, it can get a little distracting, right?
yeah. Well, like, even though it wasn't based in reality, like I think I would find myself getting into a similar loop where, again, that kind of going back to the money, of being like, well, what is money? And then researching like the history of like trade and money, and like just trying to ground it in a reality too, instead of just being like, oh, money exists now. But and then it trips me up, because I was like, money doesn't mean anything. It's this fake thing, and then I spend a day just sort of like, being like, oh my God, money is like, what? Like, it's just number, it doesn't exist. And I don't know. So it's funny too, that like in a different way, it can still get bogged down or like too laser focused on like a certain thing.
Yeah, definitely. And it's like, I mean, it's interesting too, because you're doing this work of like imagining a future world, right? And I think, and even though that future world is devastation in some ways, it is really imagining a story of survival, right? And like people being able to create a new world, I guess, in the face of devastation, right? And yeah, I was just curious, like, what was that like? I don't know, like, how did that, like, what was that process like to do such deep, like, future imagination work, I guess, for the book itself? Like, how did that kind of affect your own practice as an artist? Like, because there's like a lot of kind of like creative imagination that comes into like it comes into envisioning like a world where people flourish after mass devastation, right? In order to write about it.
Yeah, no, I think, no, that's a great question. I think it's a really hard question. I think ultimately, because I think it leans into some, there's sort of a genre of like dystopian or post-apocalyptic books, right? And I think that there were times where I was like, well, I don't need to reinvent the wheel. I can lean into some of those tropes. But I think at the core of it, and I think at a core of a lot of these sort of like dystopian or post-apocalyptic books, they're not about that devastation. They're not about the cruelty. They're sort of about the choices. And I think that was something that I really was conscious of, is I wanted, if there was violence, I wanted to imagine a world. I mean, we could see it now, right? Like people can't even wear a mask to take care of other people. So I think it's not too far off that if the world is destroyed, that people are going to resort to violence and this sort of idea of like, me first, my survival, right? But I wanted to be like, I kind of wanted to juxtapose that against the kids who like are sort of, they're kind of entering this world, but they're like, they want to do it in a more kind way. And I think some of the, I think that there's a pull between some of the characters where, you have Virginia, who's a little craftier and like has a lot of guile to her character, but she still struggles with sort of the violence that exists in the world. You have Harry, who's the youngest, who is sort of more like he's the child, and he sees this horrible world still with sort of hope to it. And then you have Wesley, who's sort of stuck in the middle, and he kind of bounces. He's struggling between the two. And I think those sort of they're almost like three different levels of like empathy and kindness. But I do know that I wanted it to be like, I didn't want the violence or that world, that cruelty of the world to be, I wanted it to be there, but I wanted to sort of there to be hope. And again, like survival doesn't have to mean like stepping on somebody to survive. And I think I didn't even kind of realize it until, a former student of mine, Zan Drake, I hired them to do some of the post-production stuff to like get the files ready for print. And I remember Zan reading it and Zan talking about how they saw this other theme that was really relevant to them as, like a young person, and this idea of like, this world, this violence is set because that's the way that grownups essentially decided to make it, And then you have these kids who are constantly seeing that and being like, it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be this way. And they related to it in the sense that like they're being handed this world that has been like raped and pillaged of like resources and this inequitable system. And grownups are like, sorry, that's the way it is. You know what I mean? And so they have to be like, what kind of message does that say? What is it like to be a young person now and be like, here you're handed this world that is destroyed and try to find hope in it? And I think the only way, you know, and so it was one of those things where I was like, yes, that was totally intentional. I totally meant to do that. But it was really nice when someone saw something in your work that you kind of didn't, I think, consciously do, but it kind of came up naturally.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, you can see that theme like so clearly in the fact that like it's, you know, it's the young people who are teaching the adults the lessons, right? Like, and it's like Ginny's way to deal with the problems and to like fight and to live are the right solutions, right? That the others aren't taking. So yeah, so it's like really presenting in some ways like this like a visionary future, even amid the devastation. Yeah, I was wondering too, like were there other influences that you took from while writing that, you know, could be like other dystopian works or things that even are in different art forms, for instance, that sort of influenced the writing?
Yeah, I think, you know, I don't know that there were a lot of like off the top of my head, like, oh, these dystopian works. Because I think I kind of wanted to, I knew that I would be leaning into some tropes, and I didn't want to like look at those, because sometimes it's like you look at them to research them, but then they end up like kind of absorbing into your brain, and then you end up using those tropes. So I tried to stay away from that a little bit. I think that some of the visual stuff there was a book, I can't remember the photographer's name, but it's called Detroit Disassembled. And I have it in my bookshelf in the other room. I should have had it prepared just in case, but it's this guy who just went around to these like rundown, dilapidated places in Detroit and took pictures of them. And just like, I think I used that in terms of like, what is visually, what's a natural way that things would decay, or what's the look of it would be, you know? I wanted to look at that. I'm trying to, you know, I was kind of well into working on it, but I think, you know, The Levers was like a big influence as I was writing, to just be like, oh, how do I, you know, like, I just love the way, you know, I felt like The Levers was like, I love that book, but it also was one of the hardest books I've read in like a long time, because I think you do such a good job of like, it takes you to these places of kind of like hopelessness or despair and these character decisions, and you're just like, oh my God, I just remember being like, putting it down and being like, I don't know that I can handle this, but like I just need a break from it. But then I'm like, but I want to know what happens. And then just like leaving that hope, and like trying to, like, it's not like, oh, everything's wrapped up with a bow and it's nice, but because that's not the way the world is. But it's still nice enough that like, I don't want to just read something that's like horrible happening all the time. You know, I want there to be some hope. And I think that was like encouraging to read as I was writing. And I think, you know, it's funny, I'm like totally blanking on some like other books, but I would just say, I think it's not related to sort of the apocalypse or world building, but Kevin Huizenga is a cartoonist who, if any of my students are here, I kind of shove his work down their throat, because I just love the way he uses time. And I think that's an opportunity in comics, is to kind of like, it's not like a movie that I have to show time happening A, B, C, D, is, you know, even those moments that I showed in the beginning of that scene that I showed, there's the big shot, and then there's two smaller shots that are quiet moments, but we're seeing Ginny moving, but we're not seeing her move those other panels. So do those panels actually happen after she's there, or do they happen before she's there? And so it's, I don't know, it sounds kind of like nerdy and kind of pretentious, but I think that like, he was probably like the biggest influence on me. And I don't think it's as apparent, but just like how to play with time when making comics.
Wow. Yeah, I have to check that out. I mean, I feel like just reading comics, I think of, as a novelist, how envious I am of this tools. Like, I mean, not only the ability to like produce visual art, but also like, yeah, as you mentioned, like, yeah, you can do so much work in like one panel or one page, or the absence of one panel or one page, that is just like a really different tool set than like having to like write paragraphs, right?
Yeah, you know,
yeah,
I totally understand that, but I also feel like it can be the grass is always greener, because there's some panels where I'm just like, this is a bitch to draw. Like, I don't want to draw this. Like, I wish I could just be like, you know, I can't, again, I'm not a good writer. Like I am not a good writer in terms of like writing words and paragraphs. So it's like, I have to lean on the things that I do better. But I think, you know, there were some times where I was definitely like, I would daydream and I'd be like, man, I would love to not have to draw anything.
Right. Just
That
write.
would be great. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the lines that I loved from, you know, the author's note at the end of the book was you talked about comics existing and functioning in the in-between places. And I was wondering if you could talk more about that, like what that means.
Yeah, no, I think that is in reference to sort of like the spot color. But I think that that's my favorite thing about comics is because I mean, like I love books and I love the engagement of the reader and that like, you know, you could have 5 different people, 10 different people, 100, you know, people read a book and you can describe a scene, describe the characters as much as you can. But if we were able to take snapshots of people's brains, they would all look different. And so like everybody's engaging in their creativity and their imagination to read like a novel. And I love that. But I also love sort of, you know, like film or animation, something that's much more passive and that we're given information and, you know, just what goes into that, what goes into the crafting of a, you know, like if we're watching a movie, like the costumes and the actor sort of bringing that character to life. And so I think that comics exist in that middle space because I can give information, but you still get to decide like, what are the sounds, you know, hopefully your sound effects are better than the ones I read at the beginning of the thing. Hopefully the voices are different, but like, you know, or even when action's being shown, like comics are a static medium and like no action actually happens. The action happens when you decide to make it happen. And so I think that's what I really, really love about it is, and I think that I've dug myself in a little bit of a hole in making comics because I know a lot of friends that make comics that can do animation or storyboarding because there's like a very common skill set amongst them in visual storytelling. But I think the way that I approach comics is, it's going to sound kind of lazy, but it's just like, how can it be as clear as possible while drawing as little as possible for me? Or like how can I get the reader to be as involved as possible in this process of this action? Well, you know, I don't know if that makes sense. So it's like, so I kind of like dug this comics hole really deep because I've gotten really into the technical aspects of like the language of comics. And I think it makes like, I don't even know if anybody would notice these things, but it's just like, that's sort of my thought process of it. And so in reference to sort of what it is in the end of the book is a lot of people ask why it's a spot color instead of a full color. And there's like a practical reason for that because time, I can't color it. I can't pay someone to color it. So I just need to do one color. Like, and I don't know, you know, there's a lot of that I think in my work is it's just like, it's problem solving and you kind of need to get it. I don't know if it can work the same in writing, but you know, it's a job, right? And not every day of the job, like sometimes you just have to get the work done, right? But so I think the spot color is nice because it can still lets me show form and light and shadows and things like that. But at the same time, it lets the reader imagine what the rest of that, like I'm like kind of taking them halfway and then I'm like, okay, now you have to imagine the rest of it now.
Right. Yeah, that's great. I love that. And yeah, I love the idea of it sort of being in between like pure text and then like moving image, right? And there is so much that like, you're right, there is no action. Like the action is like what we make out of what you put on the page. I see we have some audience questions. Shall we?
Yeah, let's dig in there. Yeah.
Looks like the top upvoted question is, what is the secret to developing good sound effects?
That's funny that's like I love that question. I think I think what I do is I'll do what I did when I was reading is I'll try to imitate a sound with my mouth or just like, what is it, you know, like I'll try to make the onomatopoeia for it. And it's actually fun. It makes me think of an exercise. I don't always do it in my classes, but sometimes we'll do is like when we're talking about sound effects and lettering, it's just like, well, what's the sound, like this is kind of lowbrow, but it's like, what's the sound of a fart? How would you bring that to life? Because there's so many different like farts. And so it's like, you know, it's just like you there's no like, but just it's like make those noises. And like, again, it sounds totally, but this totally got off topic. But I think it is also part of the world building, right? Of like immersing a reader is like creating a visual representation of a sound that a reader has to make up. This goes back to our earlier, that question about the in-between spaces. It's like, I have to visually represent something that someone is going to hear in their mind. So I need to figure out how to not just come up with the letters, but how the visuals also kind of add to that,
Right, right.
So,
yeah, you know what? I actually noticed that. I think it was like one of the characters coughed and it was KOF, right? And so it's just like, wow, that's really like, yeah, part of me was like, is that part of like comics lexicon to like spell it KOF instead of COUGH? Or is it more like, yeah, it's like a more direct representation of what that sounds like without it naming the cough.
Yeah, or maybe like the harder, like instead of, yeah. So it's fun. I love that question because I don't think I've ever had to answer that question. That was a good question.
Yeah, we have another one that says, you talked about this a little bit, but like, was it obvious to you that the book should be set in California with that particular disaster? And did you consider other settings or disasters?
I think I think it just came naturally because I grew up on the West Coast. I mean, my family moved around a lot when we were kids, but a lot of my family's in California, and I do think there's also, growing up, there's the joke of like, oh, California will sink in San Andreas Fault, it'll sink into the ocean, we'll have beachfront property, all that sort of stuff. And so like that, there was some of that in there too. But I do think that, and I think that, there was a point in college where I was really into sort of Westerns and the idea of the West, this sort of like, it's sort of a fantasy, and sort of like how it represents sort of like, this American idea of like, oh, we can go make it on our own or whatever, whether however false that ended up being and however rife of, violence and oppression and all that sort of stuff. And so I think that there's some of that too, is I think that there's definitely an inspiration of like that journey and the like that West, and also just like road trips up and down California and Oregon my whole life. I think I'm just firmly rooted in that. And maybe it's avoiding having to do more research to like set it somewhere else, like that could be part of it too.
Yeah. Like, you know what it looks like now, so you can imagine what it's going to look like when it's like devastated.
Yeah, exactly. Like I think that there's parts where, even though it's split, like, there's points where you're driving from like San Diego to Portland. There's some really beautiful places, but there's also some places that are just really boring. And I tried to capture those even as they're traveling along the strait, the body of water, to just show that like boring landscape too, and like capture that. So it's almost like similar to a road trip that you would take.
Right. Yeah, we have another question that's sort of related to the West Coast. Somebody said that it reminds them of Ursula Le Guin's books, especially City of Illusions and The Dispossessed, and they were wondering if her work influenced yours in any way.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit that, like, well, first off, anytime anyone's going to put me in the same sentence as Ursula Le Guin, like, I'm going to be very, very thankful and like humbled and honored. But I can't say, unfortunately, she's one of those people that everything I hear about her books gives me a reason to want to pick it up. But then they just end up sitting on my to read pile. That just keeps growing and growing. And, I hope, one of these days I just need to sit down and do it, because I'm aware of what she did for science fiction and how she approached science fiction. And I want to be able to like speak about that clearly and accurately. So that's definitely on my list of things to do and read.
Great. Yeah, someone else asked about, talking about the notes in the back of the book about your process and how the drawings changed as you worked. And said the pink is beautiful, and asked, will the second book be a different color? And that sort of intersects with something I wanted to ask too, which is what are you working on next?
Yeah, so I think book 2 will probably be pink. Again, the reason I sort of talked about why the spot color, but not sort of why the pink. And I just think the pink, I can't see it any sort of other color. And so I definitely, with 2 books, it's not 2 books because it's 2 books because it's just like a time consumption thing, or like the time it takes to make a book. It's like, ideally, if I had all the time and all the sort of like money in the world, this would be one big, like 400-page volume. But I think we kind of have to split it up. So it'll definitely be pink. It'll be the same pink. I'm very happy with that. And then as far as what I'm working on next is, so Odessa 2, I have it sort of plotted. I have the ending and I'm very happy with the ending. And endings are hard to land. And so when you have an ending that you think just works perfectly, like I'm really excited to do it and I want to do it. And I'm excited. I have the start of book 2 figured out. It's just the middle stuff that's a little blurry, but I'm actually, so it's on the back burner a little bit because I signed 2 books with Candlewick with Walker, their graphic novel imprint. And so I get to work with Susan Van Meter, who is this amazing editor. And I'm working on a middle grade book that kind of something similar where it's taking science fiction as the backdrop and it's kind of trying to ground it in reality. It's called True Tales of a 7th Grade Lizard Boy. And it kind of uses, you know, the science fiction trope of like the lizard people that have to wear the different face. And they have to flee from the center of the earth to come and live amongst humans. And just sort of, that was sort of inspired by my mom and my uncle's experience and sort of the immigrant experience about like how you kind of have to turn into a different person. And like, I mean, code switching, I guess, is what, you know, I think that the appropriate term for it. And so, but just this idea of like having to figure, like literally put on a different face and how to adjust. And so that's what my next book is. I just got edits back from the draft of that. So I hopefully will start drawing it. I think it should be out 2022. And so, you know, there's another book there, but Odessa, you know, so Odessa might be a little bit longer. Odessa 2 might be a little bit longer than I wanted, but I'm really excited to just have the opportunity to make books, right? You know,
and we're excited to read them. Somebody else asked, okay, so this is a love note to your brothers, and I'm curious to know if you and your brothers were comics lovers. Is it something that you shared, or was arts and comic drawing uniquely yours and your family? What got you into comics?
I think growing up, we read as many comics as maybe other, you know, we read a lot of Far Side and Calvin and Hobbes, which I think kind of says how old I am. And just like looking forward to the newspaper comics.
Yeah.
And I think we all drew just for, in the same way that kids always draw, but I think there was always a rich, like, I think something about my family that I appreciate, even if I'm the only one that maybe pursued the arts. Well, I guess my youngest brother is a musician too, but there was always a strong sense of storytelling. I think my dad's side of the family is, you know, they're from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. They're bullshitters. They love telling stories and exaggerating, and that there's that there too, you know, there's that influence of that like oral tradition of telling stories. I think, you know, with the Vietnamese side of my family too, there's a strong sense of storytelling. My mom's a historian, and she writes poetry. There's a strong sense of storytelling there in history. It's telling the stories and making sure the right stories are being told and told correctly. And so I think that's maybe where more of the influence was. I read some comics as a kid, but I don't think I really thought seriously about comics until I was in school, and I hated doing illustration. I didn't know what to do. And my friend Jason kind of suggested that I make comics, and I fell in love with it immediately. So.
Wow, that's great. I love that. Okay, here's another question about you. Everybody always wants to know about the author. Which character do you associate with the most? What would be your strengths after the big earthquake? Are you good at camping?
Now that I'm older, I'm horrible at camping. My body aches sleeping on the ground. I think when I was a kid, we used to do things like, let's just sleep on the floor without blankets to see how tough we are. And you can do that when you're a kid, but now it's like, I need a bed, I need a air mattress, I need this sort of thing. I think, obviously, like, I think there's not, it's very thinly veiled that I'm Virginia, not all the way, but I think just like being the oldest brother, being the oldest sibling, having to sort of like balance that, like, when are you a brother or a sister or sibling, and when are you have to fill in more of a parental role, that frustration of like being torn between, you write what you know. And I think a lot of the things Ginny's going through, I went through. And again, but then at the same time, like, there's also part of me that is Harry or Wesley who wants to just do things right, or like, I don't know, I think there's part of us everywhere, but I think I'm obviously a fill-in. I think Ginny is very obviously me.
And somebody else asked, Could you give more info on the role $4 plays in the story for the three main characters, and how did you come up with his background story? He was a cool character.
Oh, thanks. So $4 is almost like directly based off of one of my uncles. He's like the closest. He grew up with us, like he's my mom's brother, and they escaped from Vietnam together, and so he was always around, and he's probably one of the, I mean, but outside of my parents, one of the biggest influences in my life, because he taught us. I remember learning how to swim by him, like kind of throwing us out of a canoe, and like, he giving us that chance to be afraid a little bit and learn it, but like I never felt unsafe with that, or like, he would take us to do trips, or he would, he kind of has that like survival, or like kind of scamming the system sort of like attitude, or like, he, like, for example, he lived in Portland for a couple of years when I first moved here, and he'd get a speeding ticket, and his wife would be so upset, and he's just like, or he'd be like, but all the times I sped and I never got a ticket, you pay it once in a while, or like this attitude of like, he would try to, I remember Christmas time, we'd all come to visit his house on Christmas, and he wouldn't have a DVD player, but he'd buy one for Christmas, and then he'd return it after Christmas was over. And so, but just this idea of just this like, kind of like, but this like charming snake oil salesman who, is just like, you're just like, this guy's I mean, my uncle's a great guy, but just, I kind of love that like roguish character. And so a lot of the character is based off of my Uncle Fook. But I think the name $4 is based off of one of my aunts had a boyfriend whose name was, I met him as Uncle $4. And I was just like, what? And they're like, yeah, you just call him Uncle $4. And I never found out why, but I like that idea. And so it's that sort of reverse engineering of like, I want to use that. So I'm kind of basing some of the personality off of my Uncle Fook, and I'm going to use this name. And then it's like, well, how does he have the name?
Right.
$4, and then you built a world, you have a character, and you just try to reverse engineer or problem solve that narrative,
Yeah. Wow. I love that. I mean, I love that character too. And that backstory. All right. I think we have time for one last question. So someone asked, do you write dialogue in a similar way that you write sound effects? Do you speak the dialogue out loud to yourself as you're writing to capture the characters' voices? That's a good question.
That's a good question. I think I kind of do. I think what I do, because comics I don't have to write. I like when I'm writing, I'm really writing what's happening, and I'm writing the dialogue. And so I'll try to think about the conversations that are happening. And then, you might have to go back and edit or cut things out. But really, that's sort of my first approach. Is I just write down like, Virginia, you stupid turd, get back here. And then, Harry and Wes run away. Virginia says, I told you, you got to come back here. I got to take care, and so that's sort of how I approach. And I think, it's interesting too, because something I'm really conscious of like reading dialogue out loud, like at the beginning of this sort of event, is that like comics dialogue fits within comics. Like, I think like, if I were to write, if I had the ability to write Odessa as a novel, and the work that you sort of, the work that you do, Lisa, is like, I don't know that dialogue would fit there. Because I don't know that it's almost like it like comics has a natural sort of like you said, like sort of like a, vocabulary, or like sort of, it's the same way where sometimes too, is I think that this is why there's sometimes comics don't translate well to like live action or something, because it can be a little cheesier, or a little bit like, I don't want to say campier, because it's not like you can't have serious comics, but I think that there's like more leeway to suspend your disbelief in dialoage when you're reading it, and then to read it out loud. Like, again, like I was reading it out loud, and part of me was just like, oh, I don't like the way that dialogue sounds. It doesn't sound natural, but maybe it sounds natural when you're reading it to yourself quietly,
Yeah. Or I mean, yeah, and it's like inseparable from the visuals, right? So it's like, if it was just purely text on the page, it wouldn't make sense without the rest of it.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And so it's like I can lean on the visuals and the acting of the characters to help express the dialogue, because there's also just like a realistic problem of like, the more dialogue I have, the less space I have for images. So you have to try to like make it as concise as you can while still getting sort of the feeling, you know, to leave room for the images.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. I think that's all we got time for.
Cool. I think that they said, as Emily said, that there's going to be a hard, well, I think before we get cut off, I just want to say thank you for Powell's, but thank you so much, Lisa, like to have you talk, you know, and I wish I wanted to kind of talk to you more about sort of your writing process and stuff like that, but it really meant a lot for me to have you be here. And I know that Emily will probably say it again, but please, if you're looking for something to read, I think the Leavers is one of the best books of the last 3 years. And I think that it's so much more important now. I think just with everything that's going on, it's crazy. It shouldn't be that relevant right now but you know, just with, yeah, I don't know, but definitely please, thank you, Lisa, and everyone pick up the Leavers.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks for having me here. It was a pleasure to chat.
Well, thank you both so much. This was wonderful. It was really a pleasure to welcome you. And thank you everyone out there for joining us. Please do purchase copies of both Jonathan and Lisa's books. You can visit us online at powells.com. This event, along with many of our other previous events, will be on our YouTube channel if you're interested in rewatching it. And we look forward to seeing you for another event soon. Until then, take care and have a great night, everyone.
All right, thanks, Emily. Thanks, Lisa, again. Appreciate it. Bye, everyone.
Bye.